For centuries, the story seemed simple: a prophet in Mecca, a revelation in a cave, a flight to Medina, a growing community, a final message that changed the world. This is the traditional narrative, told in classrooms, sermons and textbooks across the globe. But what if I told you that when historians go looking for evidence, almost nothing from the 7th century confirms it? For over 20 years, I've taught medieval history in schools, and in my own research, digging through coins, papyri, early chronicles, and the Quran itself, I stumbled on a truth I did not expect. The earliest historical record does not match the traditional story. No archaeological Mecca, no clear Medina, no early biographies of the Prophet, and non-Islamic sources. They describe something entirely different. If you care about real history, not comforting legends, stay with me, because in this video I'm breaking down 4 major contradictions at the heart of early Islamic origins. Contradictions that force us to rethink one of the most influential stories in world history. Ignore this, and you're left with a Middle Ages built on sand. Understand it, and the 7th century opens before you in a completely new way. By the end of this episode, you will never look at early Islam or the Middle Ages the same way again. The story begins with a gap, a silence so large that it reshapes everything we think we know. When viewers see a timeline of early Christianity, early Buddhism, or even the Roman Empire, there is something comforting in the evidence letters. Inscriptions, coins, ruins, documents written during the lifetimes of the founders themselves. But when we turn to the origins of Islam, that pattern breaks. The 7th century, the century of Muhammad, is almost empty, and the silence is not accidental. It is a silence that challenges every simple version of this story. For decades, historians took the later Islamic sources at face value. The biographies of Muhammad, the hadith collections, the early histories, they seemed detailed, complete, almost cinematic in how they describe events. But then something strange emerged. Almost all of these texts were written long after the events they describe. Muhammad dies around 632 AD, but the earliest surviving biography appears around 150 years later. The major hadith collections appear more than 2 centuries later, and the most influential histories, like those of Al-Tabari, are even further removed. Imagine trying to write the story of Napoleon today without any surviving documents from his lifetime. Imagine reconstructing the Roman Empire using sources written in the Middle Ages. That is the scale of the challenge. And suddenly, historians realized something important. The traditional narrative might not be a direct memory of the 7th century. It might be a memory of how the 7th century was imagined in the 9th. The gap changes everything. To understand why, we must go back to the world where those later sources were written, the Abbasid Empire. By the 9th century, Islam was no longer a small community in Arabia. It was the ruling faith of a vast empire stretching from North Africa to Persia, a civilization with libraries, scholars, courts, and a growing sense of identity. And this identity needed a history, a clear story, a unified story, a story that explained where everything began. The Abbasid caliphs supported scholars who wrote biographies, compiled hadith, and organized traditions into neat narratives. But they were not working with contemporary documents from Muhammad's own time. They were working with oral traditions, memories, legends, and inherited stories, many of which had changed over generations. And here is where the silence becomes dangerous. When there are few early documents, memory becomes flexible, stories shift, motives evolve, details change depending on who tells them and who needs them. Some scholars, like Patricia Crone and Michael Cook, argued that these later accounts were shaped as much by the politics of the Abbasid age as by the events of the 7th century. They were not just preserving history, they were deciding history. But this raises a deeper question, one that scholars still debate. Why is there so little contemporary evidence from early Islam? Why do we not have early inscriptions mentioning Muhammad? Why do we not have dated manuscripts from the 630s or 640s detailing events in Mecca and Medina? Why do the earliest official documents focus on tax, administration, and military rule, yet barely mention the new religion? Was the early Islamic movement not yet defined as a religion? Were the earliest believers part of a wider monotheistic reform movement? Did religious identity develop gradually? This silence invites speculation, but it also creates an opportunity. Because when the sources are missing, the historian must look elsewhere. And this is where the story becomes even more dramatic. Outside the Islamic world, in Christian, Jewish, and Persian texts, Muhammad and his followers do appear. But these early references describe something different from the later Islamic tradition. A leader, yes. A movement, yes. But not yet a fully formed religion. A political leader, a military figure, a monotheist, but not yet the prophet described in the 9th century sources. Why do these earliest external accounts differ so much from the later Islamic ones? This is the heart of the mystery, a puzzle at the center of early Islamic history, a question the silence forces us to confront. And the silence is not only in manuscripts, it is in archaeology, it is in inscriptions, it is in the physical record of the 7th century. We have coins, we have papyri, we have administrative documents, but these items raise more questions than they answer. Coins carry Sasanian and Byzantine symbols. Papyri mention leaders, but not a new revelation. Inscriptions speak of God, but not yet of the prophet's message. And the cities central to Islamic tradition, Mecca and Medina, leave almost no trace from the time of Muhammad. It is as if the early Islamic movement existed in a fog, never fully visible to the outside world until much later. And this forces a simple but powerful idea. Maybe early Islam did not begin the way the later sources say it did. Maybe the earliest believers understood themselves differently. Maybe the story of its origins was still being shaped long after the events had passed. By the end of the Abbasid age, the narrative was complete. A prophet with a detailed biography, a community with a clear identity, a revelation with a structured history, a past that explained the present. But the silence behind that narrative never went away. And in the next chapter, we step directly into that silence, into the contradictions between Islamic and non-Islamic accounts. Contradictions that reveal a world more complex and more surprising than the traditional story ever imagined. Because to understand early Islam, we must first understand the voices that disagree, and those voices are about to speak. When we open the pages of early Islamic tradition, the story appears complete. A prophet, a revelation, a community united by faith, battles, treaties, miracles, a narrative polished and preserved across centuries. But the moment we turn away from these later Islamic texts and look at what the outside world recorded in the 7th century, something unexpected happens. The story changes. It fractures. It contradicts itself. It becomes far more complex than the single unified version found in the later biographies. And this is where the real mystery begins. Imagine living in the 630s or 640s. You are a Christian monk in Palestine, or a Jewish scholar in Mesopotamia, or a bureaucrat in a Persian city recently conquered by Arab forces. Arab armies appear suddenly on the horizon. Their leaders are unfamiliar. Their purpose is unclear, so you write down what you see, and what you record does not match the later Islamic story. One of the earliest documents mentioning Muhammad is the Doctrina Jacobi, written in the 630s, just a few years after his death. It describes a prophet among the Arabs. But this figure is not outlined as a religious founder. There is no mention of the Quran, no new scripture, no declarations of a new faith. Instead, Muhammad appears as a political leader, a military guide, a man leading a people in revolt against the empires around them. To the Christian writer of the Doctrina Jacobi, the Arab movement is unsettling, but not yet recognized as a distinct religious movement. Why? Were the early Muslims not yet presenting themselves that way, or did the outside world simply not understand what was happening? This is one of the contradictions that begin to open the story from within. Another early source, the Syriac Chronicle of 640, also references Muhammad. But again, the picture is very different. Here, Muhammad is a commander, a leader of raids, a figure driving military expansion. There is no mention of a fully developed religious movement. No description of prayer, law, or scripture. No references to Mecca or the Kaaba. Instead, the Arab attacks are seen through the lens of geopolitics, a new tribal coalition pushing against the crumbling Byzantine and Sasanian frontiers. So the question grows stronger. Why do the earliest external accounts describe a political movement, while later Islamic sources describe a religious revolution? Did the early community appear differently depending on who looked at it? Or did the religious narrative develop later, reshaping how the past was remembered? Jewish sources from the 7th century also mention the Arab conquests, but these texts rarely speak of a prophet or a revelation. Instead, they describe Arab rulers as supporters of monotheism, but not of a new, separate religion. Some even suggest that early Arab believers saw themselves aligned with existing monotheists, not distinct from them. This detail becomes essential later when we examine the Quran's terminology. But already here the contradiction is visible. The earliest evidence outside Islam does not describe an entirely new religious community. It describes a coalition of monotheists, tribes, and warriors with evolving identities, a community that may not yet have called itself what the later sources call it. The contradictions do not end when we return to Islamic tradition. In fact, they multiply. Take the accounts of Muhammad's interactions with Jewish tribes in Medina. Some sources describe alliances and peaceful coexistence. Others describe dramatic conflicts, sieges, and mass executions. Were these events exaggerated? Were they shaped by later political or theological motives? Or did competing groups preserve different memories of the same period? Then there are the contradictions in the stories of Revelation. Some traditions say the first revelation came in a cave. Others place it in a different setting entirely. Some speak of early persecution in Mecca. Others suggest a slow, steady spread of followers. Even the timeline of events, battles, migrations, treaties, shifts from source to source. It is not a single story. It is a mosaic, a collage built from fragments that do not always fit. Every major religion has conflicting traditions. This is normal. Humans remember differently. Stories evolve. But the contradictions in early Islamic tradition have a unique weight. Because there are so few contemporary documents to verify or challenge them, when sources appear centuries later and disagree, historians must ask which memory is older, which is influenced by politics, which reflects theology rather than history, which version survived because it supported the rulers of the Abbasid age. Contradictions are not simply errors. They are clues. They reveal how stories grew, shifted, and solidified across time. And these contradictions do something else. They force us to reconsider what early Islam looked like, not in the 9th century, but in the 7th. What if the early believers were seen differently by different groups? A Christian monk may have seen a political threat. A Persian administrator may have seen a new ruling elite. A Jewish scholar may have seen fellow monotheists. A later Muslim historian may have seen the hand of God guiding a prophet. Each lens shapes the story, each perspective creates a different truth. The contradictions show us that early Islam was not a simple movement. It was a shifting landscape of alliances, revelations, conflicts, and identities, a movement that different communities interpreted through their own fears, hopes, and experiences. But the biggest contradiction is still ahead, because when we leave the manuscripts and look at the ground, the coins, the papyri, the ruins, we find an even sharper conflict. The archaeology does not match the later stories. Mecca leaves almost no trace. Medina remains silent. Coins raise questions. Inscriptions create new mysteries, and the physical world tells a story that is very different from the texts. In the next chapter, we step into that material silence and confront the evidence that challenges the traditional narrative more directly than anything else, because sometimes history survives not in words, but in what is missing. If you enjoyed this episode and want to go even deeper, I would love to warmly invite you to join me on Patreon. There, you'll get access to the full, in-depth academic documentary on this same topic, a detailed exploration of early Islamic history that goes far beyond what I can show on YouTube. You'll also receive an exclusive ebook complete with sources, recommended literature, and additional notes to guide your own research. But that's only the beginning. As a Patreon member, you unlock full access to all future deep academic dives into the Middle Ages, special long-form videos created only for patrons. Your support on Patreon allows me to create content that is slower, richer, and far more detailed. True, long-form historical storytelling for viewers who want more than a surface-level summary. If that sounds like something you'd enjoy, you are warmly invited to join me. The link is below, and I can't wait to share the next deep dive, Genghis Khan's world, with you. History is built not only on words, but on things: coins, stones, ruins, inscriptions, objects that survive long after voices fall silent. When written sources are missing or uncertain, archaeology becomes the anchor. The physical world becomes the witness. But in the case of early Islam, the earth itself complicates the story, because when we go searching for the material traces of one of the most important transformations in world history, we find almost nothing. And the silence is louder than expected. Coins are among the most reliable historical artifacts. They are dated, produced by governments, circulated widely, hard to fake, hard to reinterpret. They should tell a clear story. But early Islamic coins tell a story filled with contradictions. In the decades after the Arab conquests, coins across the Middle East still show Sasanian kings and Zoroastrian fire altars. Byzantine icons continue to appear. Crosses, imperial portraits, symbols of empires that were already collapsing. The only new element is a small Arabic phrase, Bismillah, in the name of God, not in the name of Islam, not the name of the Prophet, not verses from the Quran, just a monotheistic formula. Fred Donner noted that these early coins reveal something striking. The conquerors were not yet presenting themselves as a new religious civilization. They were inheriting the bureaucratic and monetary systems of the empires they replaced. This raises difficult questions. If Islam had already emerged as a distinct religion in the 600s, why do the coins, official state instruments, not reflect it? Why does a new religious empire mint coins covered in the symbols of the old? Why does the Prophet's name not appear until much later? These are not small inconsistencies. They are foundational puzzles. Next, we turn to papyrus documents, administrative records, tax receipts, legal contracts, preserved in Egypt and the Levant. These should reveal the presence of a new religious community. They should mention Muslims, or Islam, or the Quran, or religious identity. But what we find is different. Documents from the 600s 40s and 600s 50s describe rulers as Amir al-Mu'minin, commander of the believers, a title that suggests a monotheistic leader, but does not yet mark a distinct religious group. There is no mention of Mecca, no mention of Medina, no reference to Muhammad, no new religious laws. Instead, the early Arab rulers appear as administrators focused on taxation, order, and governance. This is not the picture described in the later Islamic sources. According to them, the new Islamic state was built on the foundations of a powerful revelation, a unified religious community, and a complete system of law. But the earliest documents show something else: a pragmatic government, a broad coalition of monotheists, and a political movement still forming its identity. Why is there such a gap between the documentary evidence and the later narrative? Was early Islam not yet a clearly defined religion? Were the earliest believers part of a wider monotheistic reform movement? Did religious identity develop gradually? These questions remain open. Then there are the cities at the heart of Islamic tradition, Mecca and Medina. If the traditional narrative is correct, these cities were the center of a religious revolution that changed history forever. But archaeology tells a different story. Mecca, one of the most important cities in the narrative, has almost no archaeological evidence from the 7th century. The sacred Kaaba, which Islamic tradition places at the center of early events, has no physical remains dating to that period, no inscriptions, no ruins, no contemporary descriptions from outside sources. Medina, the city of the Prophet, presents a similar problem. No identifiable remains of Muhammad's house, no evidence of his early mosque, no material traces of the community that is said to have formed there. Some argue this is because the sites are sacred and have never been excavated. This is true, but the absence of evidence remains striking, especially when compared to other religious centers from the same era. Jerusalem leaves traces, Ctesiphon leaves ruins, Byzantine cities leave inscriptions, churches, mosaics, but the cradle of Islam remains archaeologically silent. This raises a powerful question. If these cities were the center of a new world religion, why is the physical record so thin? When we widen the lens to the entire Arabian Peninsula, the silence grows even deeper. There are few inscriptions, few dated structures, few identifiable sites tied to the early believers. The contrast with neighbouring civilizations is dramatic. The Byzantines left fortresses, monasteries and roads. The Sasanians left palaces, fire temples and inscriptions. Even pastoral nomadic groups left stone carvings and campsites. But early Islam, at least archaeologically, remains almost invisible. In the 7th century, historians have debated why. Were the early believers semi-nomadic? Were they avoiding monumental architecture? Were they uninterested in leaving inscriptions? Or was the movement simply not yet a centralized religious identity? Each answer would reshape the story in a different way. The silence of the earth does not simply raise questions, it directly challenges the later narrative. If Mecca and Medina were the centers of a great religious transformation, why do they leave fewer traces than small villages from the same period? If the early believers were guided by a complete religious system, why do the earliest administrative documents not mention it? If Muhammad's mission transformed Arabia, why do 7th century artifacts show continuity rather than revolution? Archaeology is not hostile, it is not biased, it simply speaks. But what it says does not always align with the story written 2 centuries later, and that conflict is essential for understanding early Islam, not because it disproves the tradition, but because it reveals how complex the early movement truly was. A movement shaped by politics, by memory, by faith, by later authors, and by the silence of history. But perhaps the most revealing contradiction is not in what archaeology does not show, but in what the Quran itself shows. Because when we read the Quran, we do not find a community calling itself Muslims, we find believers. A broad coalition that included Jews, Christians and monotheists of many kinds. A community far more inclusive, fluid and different from the later Islamic identity. In the next chapter, we explore this final challenge, the question of who the early believers really were, and what the Quran tells us about the origins of Islam that the later sources do not. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of the most fascinating historical puzzles of the Middle Ages. If this chapter left you with more questions than answers, that's exactly how real history works. The deeper you go, the more the past opens its hidden doors. If you want to explore those deeper rooms, I would love to invite you to join me on Patreon. There, you'll find the full-length academic documentary on this same topic, a complete exploration of the evidence, the debates, and the historiography behind the origins of Islam. You'll also receive an exclusive ebook, a full reading list for further study, and access to all future long-form historical deep dives. Your support on Patreon helps me create richer, more detailed content, and it helps build a community of viewers who love history as much as I do. If that sounds like your kind of journey, the link is below. And I would be honored to see you there. Thank you for watching, and as always, the story continues.